Make one.
Okay, so Legion was a movie directed by William Peter Blatty, author of The Exorcist.
With no
Blatty's writing
diet
drives into deeper philosophical questions about the nature of evil and spiritual belief. How does Exorcist III compare with the first film's take on good versus evil? There's a quote from the movie. This, I believe, there are forces in the universe that struggle to bring us to harm, not because we have sinned, but because we exist. How does the emphasis on psychological horror deepen the film's critique of religious and institutional authority?
What I love about The Exorcist III is that most of it is a conversation with inhuman and human evil. There's an interrogation of what evil is, and the motivations between inhuman evil and human evil, in this particular case anyway, overlap because they're both about defiling people who are good. If one thinks about what motivated the Gemini killer and what is motivating Pazuzu and the devil itself, it's that, right? Defiling God's best. Its best work.
And it's so, like, what is actually done is, like, so horrifying, right? Like, it's sort of like, oh, it's not only just this little boy, but he's, like, decapitated and, like, savagely crucified. Like, it is absolutely brutal. And they talk about, like, the nature of true evil, right? Like, it's one of those things where I feel like it does a better job of getting down to it, as opposed to, in the first movie and the book, it's like, oh, here's a crazy thing that happened. It's like this outside force. Ultimately, like, I mean, the Gemini's a guy. Granted, it comes back, but this is a person that has done these things, and so there's reconciling that. I think George C. Scott's fantastic in it.
Yeah,
I think he's fantastic in everything. I mean, look like Patton or anything like that. But Brad Dourif, like, I think that you get, like, the modern, maybe not this new film and the Joaquin Phoenix one, but I don't think, like, the modern sensibility of the Joker, you can have it without his character in Exorcist III. Like the Heath Ledger style I'm talking about. Yeah, the Brad Dourif, the performance in it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting that you make that comparison. Did you watch Joker 2, by the way?
No, fuck no.
Oh, did you like the first Joker?
I thought it was fine. I liked it better as Taxi Driver and Kings of Comedy, but like, it's a King of Comedy, not Kings of Comedy. That is a different movie.
Different film.
Yeah. Where's that crossover? I don't like I don't like musicals. It was the movie least necessary of a sequel that I can think of that wasn't called Blade Runner. Once
I saw the sequel to that, I was like, whatever this is going to be, it's going to suck.
Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner, is one of my favorite of all time. So I eventually was able to engage with 2049 on its own, just kind of like mentally putting aside the fact that it's allegedly a sequel. I like the B plot way more than the main plot, frankly, but it was fine. I like Villeneuve, but yeah, Joker 2, come on, miss me with that. Like everyone else apparently in the movie going populous, which is fine because that movie should not have been made. And like maybe this like automatic sequel when something does well, like can like die in the crib. But yeah, Exorcist 3, I mean, again, I think it's weird because I think it does almost, so the fact that it's directed by the author of The Exorcist is fascinating. The fact that it did a great job is also fascinating. But I think it would be considered elevated or considered more properly venerated if it just had been called Legion, which you really want to. And it did not. And again, because I think it was the studio execs, right? That were like, it's called The Exorcist. Why do we got to have an exorcism in it? Where is it? What is an exorcist scene?
I mean, the Exorcist movie, we have to agree. If you talk about the top horror films and even films of all time, The Exorcist is always on that list. It's like, as Toure was pointing out, it's beautifully shot, that it holds up so well. Again, I rewatched it yesterday. And
it establishes all the tropes too, right? I mean, it's the foundational film.
It is the foundational film,
and draw from the same.
But I feel like it's also like everybody agrees it's great, and that it's very important history.
So
we all
I
like
get
it.
why you're going to call it Exorcist 3, because not only can you call it Exorcist 3 and feel comfortable about kind of rewriting the wrongs that was the sequel, but you have a very important character tied to it, which is the writer who had a lot of disagreements with Friedkin's vision of his script. Right. So now he gets to kind of write his story the way he wants to see it. The studio can attach a very, very successful IP to it, because The Exorcist comes out in 73. I believe the sequel comes out in 75 or maybe even 76. It comes out pretty quick.
The second one.
The second one, yeah. Heretic.
And so by the time they do this Exorcist 3, it's 1990.
Yeah.
So they're trying to bring back this thing that they hope the sins of the second, pun intended, have been absolved.
The heresies of the second, some might say.
It's just time has absolved it. And we're going to give you this new take on it that, for me, when you first watch it, it's very 90s in the sense of it's very bright.
Yeah.
The one difference to me about the late 80s horror and once we get into 90s horror is, first and foremost, people want to stop calling it horror, because horror has such a bad name because of direct-to-video stuff and over-top gore. And so it's shot really bright, like the thrillers are shot of this era. I do think it works really well for this film. There's an unsettling nature for this film that you don't necessarily get in the first one, because as Toure and you point out, Conan, it's a character study about a priest losing his faith, a mother losing her grip on sanity to some degree because of the patriarchal healthcare system telling her, bitch, it's just you and your goofy kid. There is no such thing as demonic possession. And that movie felt dark in general, even though a lot of it's indoors. This one, a lot of it's outside dialogue.
Well, look at it when they find the crucified body of the kid, right? That's outside, and it's got, like, if I remember right, it's not only Jesus's head instead of his head, but it's in blackface with like nails driven through the eyes.
Oh, it's over the top. Yeah, oh, it's over the top.
Talk about daylight horror, man.
Yeah, no, this movie is over the top, and it pretty much lets you know from the beginning that it's going to be unsettling without being gory.
Right.
But for an audience that's primed on Schwarzenegger movies, nothing happens. And I think one of the things, and I'd certainly, The Exorcist had been one of my date litmus test films also. And, one of the things that I had picked up on with women who were, let's say, 10 years younger than me at that time or close to it, it was boring for them. And their sensibilities had shifted. They wanted more action. And I think that with the Exorcist III coming out in 1990, the slow pace of it, because it takes a long time for anything to happen, and what happens is mostly off screen, except for, of course, the actual, I had thought, unnecessary exorcism, but having seen the assembly cut, I appreciate the exorcism, and those reshoots were absolutely essential to making this film work, because if you've watched Blatty's unadulterated vision, it falls very flat. The cinematography is different. And
really?
Yes, it's terrible, actually. The cinematography in the asylum, right, where we have the exchange between Kinderman and Brad Dourif, it's totally different. The dialogue's the same. There's no Jason Miller in the original. So it's just 100% Brad Dourif. It does not work. So Blatty's vision without the studio would have been, and I say this as a huge fan of The Exorcist III, a massive flop.
But can we agree with this though? When you give someone too much control,
yes,
a la Stephen King and Maximum Overdrive.
Oh yeah.
Take the cocaine out of it. It's just you have a lot of control, and you don't know set.
For someone that isn't a filmmaker. I do agree that it's incredibly improved, and it becomes elevated because of the edits and the additions. I don't think it's bad. It's just not extraordinary. It's fine. And so it's a crazy case of, a lot of times we talk about how things can be changed and everything. Dude, there's like an extended cut of The Fall Guy. You know what I mean? The one that came, which I actually enjoyed. I like that movie, but like, I'm like, why there was 20 minutes added to this? Why? Like, this should have been like a 90-minute movie. But for something like this is a rare case where, like, if you were teaching a class of like, okay, here's how, studio intervention actually made this better. This would be the perfect example. I agree.
One of the few. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's in a rare echelon of like maybe under 10 movies. But for me, it's funny to hear about younger audiences like thinking it's boring, because the whole thing with this one is you get this unbearable sense of dread and tension.
Yeah.
Like this incredible spooky atmosphere, to the point that you get so wrapped up in it that, you know, like when you get to like one of my favorite scenes, which is it's like, oh my, like you're just, you can't even believe like it's happening, and it hits it hits you like a punch in the face, and you don't get that if you're not drawn into it.
Right. But you see nothing. Right. I mean,
and like the ceiling, which has been emulated everything from like Train Spotting to the freaking Scary Movie, right? You know, like amazing. And at the time you're like, what? And the reason why is because you're in it, you're immersed in this world, and it draws you along in such a deep and compelling way. And as someone that, again, I've love things that if you're gonna take me on a ride, I'll take the ride with you. I don't want this like super jump cut TikTok world of filmmaking.
Right.
I think it sucks. I think it's boring, and I think people these days when they're making films, they rely on vibes. Cool. Well, why don't you actually establish a vibe instead of just buy some neon lighting?
But would you agree though that because this movie takes place 17 years after the first, and if you saw the first, because as you said, Conan, there's so many bad exorcism movies that come
in
out
between
that have the title exorcism in it.
Yeah,
sure.
Because you can. That people aren't ready for this movie, because this movie also, again, comes out in 1990, before we get movies like Seven, before we get movies like Silence of the Lambs.
Right.
That do, I think, take certain beats from the way this movie is put together. And the unease of these movies, like the movies we call thrillers in the early part of the 90s, are just horror movies, but we change it up a little bit.
Yeah, Fincher built a career on it, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not that people weren't ready. I think people didn't care.
And
I think a lot of times people they're like, oh, I know what that is. I don't need to see that.
To Ray's point, that's how I felt about it for years. And it was to Ray Reed that was like, Exorcist 3 is really good, and he was having this conversation.
There it goes. You got to have a friend.
And then I was again on this date with this woman, and I didn't think to show her comedy porn, but
but you should have.
Yeah. You didn't have Crash on VHS?
Yeah. Like, what's the most shocking thing you want to see? And she was like, I'm in.
Want to see some people all horned up for dismemberment? Sure, here you go.
She was like, oh, I'm into horror movies. I was like, oh, have you seen Exorcist 3? A buddy told me it's pretty good. And she's like, no, I never seen it. We watched it. And, you know, I'm not trying to be funny. I literally jumped. You know, there's a scene everybody's been talking about in the comments that is. I've watched Exorcist 3 probably 4 or 5 times.
Get your ass every time though, right?
Every time. The hospital scene is the best use of tension.
Yeah.
And that scare when the thing comes out, it's just like, the fuck.
But watch the assembly cut, because Brad Dourif's performance is even different. Right.
Yeah. I agree.
They modulate his voice a little bit.
They didn't need to. You don't need to do
theatrical. Watch it, because this definitely is one of those cases where the studio was right.
I did see it one time.
Lighting and the level of even the performance itself of Dourif.
Yeah, I saw it one time, and I agree. It is radically different. Like, again, that's something that if you're teaching a film class, you know, just like to show A and B. But I think that if I was to compile, not even like best scenes in horror, definitely best scenes in horror, but just best scenes in general, as far as an effective scene. Here's a way. I don't care about the genre of horror, the proverbial person talking. Yeah. Well, you need to understand why this scene works the way that it does. Because if you understand how to build dramatic tension in that way, and to do something that people will never be able to forget, if they forget, you know, they'll forget the name of their children, they'll forget their own name, they'll forget their address. Like at the end of the day, right before their deathbed, oh, that scene in Exorcist 3 goes though. You know, like, because it's that affecting, right? It's one of those scenes that like you just always remember, and it would be on like the top 100 scenes of all time for any movie ever. And
I happen to.